Alright. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. I hope everyone is doing well, inshallah, and welcome to another one of our Mizan live sessions. For those who have been continuing the sessions that we've had and been following along, we are going to be discussing the tafsir of Surah Al-Qalam, and today is going to be part 2 of our discussion, inshallah. Yesterday we covered up until verse 10, I believe. Verse 8 is what we covered yesterday. And today, inshallah, we'll cover a bigger chunk of the surah because some verses that we're going to go through have to do with the story. And the story is pretty self-evident in terms of what it's trying to tell us. So today we'll cover more verses, inshallah. And this surah is an interesting surah because there was some points to discuss at the beginning. At the end, once we get to the end, there will be the topic of, we will be discussing the topic of the evil eye. And the reason why we will be discussing that is because if you look at the end of the surah, it has that famous verse that everyone, you will see when you go to the houses of people. They will usually have this verse framed somewhere. They will have it put up somewhere in their house. And usually this verse is seen as kind of like a way of protecting yourself from the evil eye. So we will delve into the topic of the evil eye. I'm just not sure if we'll have a full session on it or we'll do a part of a session on it, depending on what type of feedback we get. We might just do a full session on that to understand what our scholars believe about the evil eye, if it does exist, if it doesn't exist, how does it even work, and what are the things that you can do if it does exist for someone to protect themselves. And if it doesn't exist, then you don't even have to worry about it, right? So this verse is the verse, like I said, that's quoted very often. You will see it framed in different places in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet that the disbelievers, they were trying to do something to you with their eyes. Now, is this metaphorical speech or is this literal speech? That's where the whole discussion begins. So when we get to the end of the surah, we will have that discussion. I'm not sure if that will be tomorrow or it will be the day after tomorrow. We'll just have to wait and see how that goes, inshallah. All right. Having said that, I want to move on to do a quick review of what we've discussed yesterday, and then from there we will move on. Surah Al-Qalam, we said it was revealed mainly for the purpose of comforting the Prophet, because the Prophet was being told that he has lost his mind, that he is misguided, that he has no idea what he's talking about, that he's crazy, and because of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed Surah Al-Qalam. That's not the only theme that comes up in Surah Al-Qalam. There are other themes that come up also in Surah Al-Qalam, but this is one of the main themes that you will find in Surah Al-Qalam, especially at the beginning of it. So if you take a look at verses 1 through 6 roughly, you will find that they are talking about the Prophet. 1 through 7, I should say. They are talking roughly about how the Prophet has not lost his mind, and that the individuals on the other side are those who are misguided and they're lost. In these verses that we covered yesterday, the Quran says, إِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. We talked a little bit about the great akhlaq of the Prophet and the importance that has. And then we moved on, فَسَتُبْصِرُ وَيُبْصِرُونَ بَأَيِّكُمُ الْمَفْتُونَ إِنَّ رَبَّكَ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنْ ضَلَّ عَنْ سَبِيلِهِ وَهُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِالْمُهْتَدِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala essentially left this topic and said, listen, these guys, they won't take what you have to say. They won't listen to you. So what you need to do is you have to ignore them. فَسَتُبْصِرُ وَيُبْصِرُونَ. You will see the reality of things. They will see the reality of things, essentially referring to the day of judgment. So let them be بَأَيِّكُمُ الْمَفْتُونَ. They'll realize who is actually misguided and lost. إِنَّ رَبَّكَ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنْ ضَلَّ عَنْ سَبِيلٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows better who is on the right path and who is misguided. Okay. From verse 8 onwards is where, inshallah, we will continue today. And the message and the theme that we'll be covering today is a very, very critical one. And the reason why I say that is because it's something that you will find amongst essentially Muslim communities living in the societies that we live in today. You will see it very often. You will see it in our youth. You will see it in speakers who promote the message of Islam, including within the Shia school of thought and within the the realm of Shiism, you will find this tendency that the Quran is going to be referring to here. So from verse 8 and 9, the Quran is now going to leave the idea of whether the Prophet is crazy or he's lost his mind or anything like that. He's already denied all of that. Now the Quran is going to move on to something else. And essentially, by moving on to this separate topic, the Quran is going to explain why these individuals keep calling you these different names. The Quran is going to explain why these guys hate you so much, what they're trying to get after, essentially. That is why they keep calling you in these different names. So what is it? What lies beneath this hate? And what would you do that would make them happy and satisfied? Essentially, to what extent do you have to do things so that they would stop hating you? That's what the Quran is going to talk about right now. Okay, so verse number 8 says this, فَلَا تُطِعِ الْمُكَذِّبِينَ. So these guys keep coming and saying these nasty things to you, Ya Rasulullah. You are to persevere. You are to stay strong on your path and on your faith. Okay, but here is why they keep saying these nasty things to you, and this is what they want from you. Very beautiful. The Quran is essentially unveiling their thought process for us, right? Sometimes you see someone who's very hateful, right? They have a lot of hate. And then you might think to yourself, what on earth is there that I could do so that this person would like me? Like, what does this guy want from me, right? And a lot of times when it comes to people who are very, very hateful, you would say, well, there's nothing I could do on earth that this person would be happy with me, right? And a lot of times that's true. Sometimes there is something you can do. Of course, you won't do it because it's wrong what they're asking you to do. But if you do it, then they will be happy with you. Then they will be satisfied with you, right? That hate that they have in their heart, it will go away. Now, pay attention to what the Quran is going to say here, because this line right here, this verse right here, is very critical. فَلَا تُطِعِ الْمُكَذِّبِينَ. Don't obey those who deny our messages. Why? وَدُّوا لَوْ تُدْهِنُوا فَيُدْهِنُونَ. Because what they're looking for is they're looking for you to get a little lazy. They're looking for you to take it a little easy when it comes to our message, فَيُدْهِنُونَ, so that they can compromise as well. So what is the verses of the Quran saying here? It's saying if you want to reach a point where they will stop hating you, and of course the Quran is saying this shouldn't happen, but he's saying they will hate you until this point comes where you compromise on the message of your religion, right? Duhn comes from oil, right? When you pour oil on something, it feels smooth, for example. You pour oil on bread, for example, right? It feels smooth at that point, right? If you've been to bakeries where they're baking bread, right? A lot of times they'll pour a little oil on the dish in which they're making the bread, just so it smoothens things out. The Quran is saying they're trying to smoothen your message out. In other words, they're trying to get you to cut some corners. They're trying to get you to leave some parts of religion out, to compromise some parts, فَيُدْهِنُونَ, so that they can compromise as well. What they're looking for is for the Prophet to meet them in the middle. They'll be like, listen, we won't hate you and we won't kill you, but on the other hand, that's our compromise. On the other hand, on your compromise, we need you to do certain things as well. So when you read the sha'n and nuzul of these verses, what you find is that they came to the Prophet and they said, listen, you keep talking about this Allah, you keep talking about this God, He is Ar-Rahman, He is Rahim, and the most important thing is that He's the only one out there. Well, if you could just include our gods with your gods, like talk about your God. Your God is, He is what He is, and He's fine. No worries, right? You can essentially continue to propagate your message, but if you could do us a favor and you could also include with your God our gods as well. What's the problem? Why is it that you have to negate our gods by promoting your God? Now, obviously, the whole idea of Tawheed, La ilaha illallah, right? There is an idea of establishing the existence of God and also the idea of negating the existence of other gods. It has two sides to this coin, essentially, right? So there's no establishing the existence of a being like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. From their perspective, they were like, why don't you just compromise a little bit, and then we'll compromise a little bit, and we can get along, and then we won't have any more issues. Okay, this is what they came to the Prophet with. And the Quran is saying they will hate you until you start to compromise in this manner. And in other verses of the Quran we read that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the believers, He says, listen, These disbelievers, and by the disbelievers, it's referring to those who know the truth and turn away from it, not just anyone who may not be Muslim. That's not what the verse is talking about. These disbelievers, they will not settle down and they will not be satisfied until they will make you kafir. Like, they will only be happy at a point where you become kafir, where you compromise on your religion so much that essentially you're setting aside the fundamentals of your religion and essentially you are kafir. Until you do that, their hate and their dislike for you and their disgust for you will not go away. Okay, how does this apply to our life today? And why is this such a critical verse in the Quran? Because today, brothers and sisters, we also have the same situation. You see, today there are enemies of Islam who know that they can't just wipe Islam off of the earth. Like, they know they can't just get rid of it. So what are they going to do? The second best option, or the next best option, is just to get you to compromise on certain aspects of the religion. Like, call yourself a Muslim, right? Have the title of Islam, have even the appearance of a Muslim, practice those things that are normally associated with being Muslim, right? No problem. But then certain aspects of your Islam, certain aspects of your religion, if you can compromise on those, right? And we have this. For example, just one example I will give you, and there's multiple examples of this. Sometimes you will have people who will have an Islamic appearance, right? And we would look at them on a superficial level and we would say, this person is a person who represents my religion, for example. And then this same person will go and acknowledge and accept within the religion of Islam that any type of family arrangement is completely fine from the Islamic perspective. Do these two, make sense with one another? That on one hand you say I'm a person who practices Islam. On the other hand, when it comes to the different types of arrangement of family, different types of marriages, as it relates to the genders and whatnot, that you would accept any type and you say, yeah, this is also part of my religion. My religion also allows all of these things as well, right? Now, being tolerant of others and things of that nature, that's a separate thing. Whether you bring it into your religion and you speak of it as if it is something that Islam has accepted, that's a separate thing. And that's what you find some people doing, even though their appearance is very much an Islamic appearance. Their appearance is an appearance of a Muslim. This is exactly what these disbelievers wanted. This is exactly what the enemies of Islam want. That you would call yourself a Muslim, you would act like a Muslim, you would have your Eid and you would have your Ramadan, right? And you would have your spirituality going for you, your spiritual practices. But at the same time, when it comes to key and critical moments and issues, that when it comes to those, you would be willing to essentially compromise and have those things be part of your belief system as well. You can have people who would represent you, who would wear the type of clothing that you would say, this person represents me, for example. But that same person will, for example, sign sanctions against another Muslim country. That's the world that we live in today. This is exactly what the enemies of Islam have wanted, even from the Prophet himself. Because the Quran says, وَدُّوا لَوْ تُدْهِنُوا فَيُدْهِنُونَ. What they want from you is for you to compromise a little bit and meet them in the middle. What we read in the story of the Prophet ﷺ is that when they came to him and they wanted him to compromise in this fashion, that he would fundamentally compromise on his message. We read in history that famous line from him that if they take the moon and put it in one hand of mine and they put the sun in the other hand of mine, I still will not compromise on my message. This is important because it applies to our lives today as well. Another example of this is a person who, again, in terms of their Islamic appearance, in terms of certain things that are associated with being a Muslim, they will have those things, right? But then in every other aspect of their life, you will find that their lifestyle is a completely Western lifestyle and secular lifestyle. Okay, how does this match with the spirit of Islam? That's a problem that we have, brothers and sisters. Essentially, the enemies of Islam don't have a problem with you calling yourself Muslim. They don't have a problem with you having your 5 times of prayer during the day. Essentially, they have no problem with you being a spiritual person, as we say. Because just spirituality is something that hurts nobody. If you're spiritual, you have nothing to worry about. Spirituality is, in fact, a word that gets everybody to be kind of nice to you, kind of kind to you, right? Spirituality has a positive connotation to it, in fact. But then, when it comes to you accepting the religion as a whole, and not compromising on the fundamentals of this religion as a whole, that's where you will see the animosity will start to show itself. They will not have a problem if you consider yourself and call yourself a Muslim. But then, if you want to stand on the side of those who are weak, those who injustice is being done to them, then you will see that they will have a problem with you. And this is something to keep in our mind, of course, that living in the societies that we live in, it is important that as much pressure we might feel from different sides, whether it has to do with our dress code, whether it has to do with certain practices that we have in Islam, whether it has to do with the boundaries that Islam sets between genders, the rules and regulations that Islam has within the family, the way Islam has gone about the rules and regulations it has in terms of family arrangement, in terms of what genders can be with what genders, all of these issues. It's important to remember that as much pressure as we feel, we have to make sure that we don't compromise on these things. Of course, you are to be tolerant of everything based on the law. The law always stands above everything else, but as it relates to your belief and within the realm of your religion, you cannot take things that are unlawful and bring them into your religion. You can tolerate them because it's part of the law and you have to tolerate them, and you should. But do you bring that into Islam and say, yes, Islam also agrees with this? That is where the problem comes into the picture. So the Quran is telling the Prophet, listen, these guys, they will continue to hate you until a point comes where you compromise and you meet them in the middle. And like I said, that is something that is very dangerous, essentially. All right, I'm going to pause for a second, just take a look to see if we have any questions before I move on, inshallah, with the rest of the discussion. Assalamu alaikum to everybody who is with us. All right, so moving on. وَدُّوا لَوْ تُدْهِنُ فَيُدْهِنُونَ. Okay, so you don't compromise on your message. Then the Quran continues. Verse 10 through 16 are all talking about a specific type of person. وَلَا تُطِعْ كُلَّ حَلَّافٍ مَهِينٍ. And also don't obey that person who has all of these negative attributes. And the Quran is kind of going to go on a whole list of negative attributes. وَلَا تُطِعْ كُلَّ حَلَّافٍ مَهِينٍ هَمَّازٍ مَشَّاءٍ بِنَمِيمٍ مَنَّاعٍ لِلْخَيْرِ مُعْتَدٍ أَثِيمٍ عُتُلٍ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ الزَّنِيمٍ. The type of person who has all of these negative attributes, right? That he spies on others, that he has evil inside of him, that he is corrupt, for example, that he is a sinner. Don't listen to this type of a person. Now, which person were these verses referring to exactly? We don't know exactly. But it seems as though there was a particular person who had approached the Prophet again for him to compromise on his message. And the Quran is saying, don't follow this person just because he has this attribute, which is verse 14. أَنْ كَانَ ذَا مَالٍ وَبَنِينَ. Don't listen to this guy. Don't obey this guy. Don't essentially break under the pressure of this person. أَنْ كَانَ ذَا مَالٍ وَبَنِينَ. Because he has wealth, because he has this huge family. And of course, back in the day, when you had this huge family, that means you had a huge tribe. That meant you had more influence. That meant you had more authority and power. Ya Rasulullah, just because he brings the money to the table doesn't mean that you can go ahead with him. And this was a true test, brothers and sisters, and it is still a true test today as well. That people who speak on behalf of Islam, are they able, essentially, to withhold or resist, I should say, the pressure that comes upon them from those who have the bucks, from those who have the money, from those who have the wealth? Is a person who is going to preach Islam, is he going to break under that pressure or not? The Quran is telling the Prophet, listen, don't do this. Don't break under his pressure. Don't obey him just because he's bringing the money. This was also one of those tests that the Prophet had to deal with, because in specific, what we read in Islamic history is that when the Prophet started to propagate his message, a lot of the people who came and embraced the message of the Prophet, of course, were from lower sections of the society. They were from lower classes of the society. And because they were from lower classes of the society, essentially the people who were rich, the people who were wealthy, they didn't even like this religion now even more. Because now they saw the type of people gathering around the Prophet are the type of people that they don't want to associate themselves with. That's why you read in the verses of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, when the wealthy come to you and they tell you, get rid of these poor people around you, then we will follow you, don't you ever do that. Right? The Quran says you never turn your face away from those people who are poor because the wealthy are asking you to do that, right? And the Quran says if you do that, then you will be amongst the zalimeen. You will be a wrongdoer. You will be an oppressor. In history, we read that this referred to some of those close companions of the Prophet who are poor, right? Who didn't have much, like Abu Dhar, for example. He didn't have much, right? So the Quran is telling us that this is a test that everyone goes through. In particular, our Prophet had to go through. That as much as he was going to bring this message, right, there were people who had all this wealth and authority that with one command of theirs, there could be so much help going towards the Prophet. But still the Prophet could not accept their help because their help came with a price, and that price, of course, was the compromise in their religion, right? That price, of course, was bringing in a disbeliever into the realm of Islam. أَنْ كَانَ ذَا مَالٍ وَبَنِينَ إِذَا تُتْلَى عَلَيْهِ آيَاتُنَا قَالَ أَسَاطِيرُ الْأَوَّلِينَ. This is the type of person, whenever our verses are read upon him, we tell him about our verses. What he does, essentially, is he turns around and says, yeah, those myths, those legends, those old tales of the old people. You find the same tone and the same terminology today as well, brothers and sisters, right? People who don't take the time to study what Islam has to say, and then they will, when Islam says something, when they hear a hadith here or there, when they hear a verse of the Quran here or there, what do they say? Oh yeah, this stuff, these are myths. These are, tales of the old people. These are legends. These are made up stories, right? Who's seen the next world anyways? That's what they will tell you. Well, the answer is nobody's seen the next world. But if you have reason to believe it's there, then you don't have to see it. That's the answer to that question. But that's the approach that they will take. This person, when they tell him of the verses of the Quran, قَالَ أَسَاطِيرُ الْأَوَّلِينَ. What does the Quran do and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do in response? And this is the question for today. So if you're on your devices, you can, inshallah, try to answer this question. And you can send in your answers, inshallah. سَنَسِمُهُ عَلَى الْخُرْتُومِ. We will mark him on his nose. Why is the Quran saying that we will mark him on his nose? What is the Quran trying to say by this? What does it mean that you would mark someone on their nose? Okay, that's a question for you guys. This is, of course, a threat from the Quran. But why is the Quran threatening this individual in this manner? Why doesn't the Quran, for example, speak of, yes, this person is going to enter into hellfire, for example. He's going to have to deal with the punishment of hellfire. What is it specifically about having someone marked on the nose that the Quran says, سَنَسِمُهُ عَلَى الْخُرْتُومِ. We will essentially put this person in such a situation where we will mark his nose. So I'll give you guys some time to send in your answers for that question. And then we'll see if you guys can get the answer to the question. It shouldn't be too difficult of a question. Hopefully some of you guys will be able to get it. But we'll see. So again, the question is, why is it that the verses of the Quran say that we will mark this person on his nose? What does that refer to? Right? What is that supposed to symbolize? That's the question that we ask. Okay, I'm going to move on. And inshallah, I'll check for your answers as well. Now, moving on from this, the verses of the Quran then move into a story. And this is the main story that you find in Surah Al-Qalam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just told the Prophet that when this person comes with all of this wealth, all of this authority, أَنْ كَانَ ذَا مَالٍ وَبَنِينَ. He comes with his wealth and he's got his human resources, right? He's got his tribe, he's got his children. When he comes your way, tell them, and you should know that this is all a test to see what this person is going to do, and you are not to accept what he has to say. Okay, then the Quran essentially moves on to a story to explain a little bit better what is going to happen to this person who assumes he has all of this wealth, who assumes he has all of this money, who assumes he has all of this authority, but before he knows it, all of this wealth and authority is going to vanish into thin air. The Quran is trying to essentially manifest this point for us. So the Quran says, listen, إِنَّا بَلَوْنَاهُمْ كَمَا بَلَوْنَا أَصْحَابَ الْجَنَّةِ. We are testing these guys the same way we tested the people of the garden. Okay, who are the people of the garden, and how did the Quran test them, or how did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala test them, is what the verses of the Quran are going to go into. Where was this garden? We don't really know. Some have said in the area near Yemen, but we don't know that for sure. Essentially, the Quran is not even going into details to tell us where this happened, because the Quran a lot of times doesn't care about the details of these stories. For those of you who are watching the story of Yusuf that we were covering this month of Ramadan, I covered this in the first session. When it comes to the storytelling of the Quran and the storytelling that we do, there are some stark differences between the two. When it comes to the storytelling that we do, the main purpose of our storytelling essentially is to entertain. That's why you tell a story normally. Of course, there's other times and there's other purposes as well. But one of the main reasons is to entertain. And because we want to entertain, we will tell stories in a certain way, whereas the verses of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will tell stories in a different way. And there are 2 or 3 main differences in the way the Quran tells a story and the way we tell a story. The first one, and the one that will essentially pop up and stand out the most, is this: that when it comes to us, because we're trying to entertain this individual, we will add all of these unnecessary details. Because when you have details, you have something to delve into. You connect with that story so much better, but not connecting so much in terms of with the moral of the story necessarily, but you essentially connect more so with the atmosphere of the story, right? You're more entertained as you are going through that story. And this is something that the Quran doesn't care for too much. The Quran, when you go through the stories of it, a lot of times, a lot of details that we would have assumed that they're very interesting and juicy details, as I say, or as I call it, you find that the Quran doesn't even mention them. The Quran just passes over them like the Quran doesn't even care about them, essentially. That's why when you look at the stories of the Quran, a lot of times there are many details are not mentioned. Some of which of these stories that we do have details about them, 90% of them a lot of times come from hadith, right? That the Ahlul Bayt have mentioned. But essentially the Quran is saying that, listen, as it relates to the moral of the story and the main purpose of the story, knowing these details, not too important. It's very interesting when you look at the story of Suratul Kahf, right? The people of the cave. What you find is that the people of the cave, we didn't know how many people there were, right? Some have said 5, some have said 6, some have said 7. When you look at the verses of the Quran, the question is, does the Quran tell you how many people there were? Like, the Quran tells their whole story, obviously. But at the end of the day, does it tell you how many people were in the, in this people of the cave, or the Ashabul Kahf? How many people were in their group? Does the Quran tell us? The answer is no. In fact, it seems as though, in my words, the Quran is trying to torture us a little bit, because the Quran will actually go through 3 different opinions and still won't tell you which opinion is correct, right? Like, it's as if God is actually making a point that, listen, I really don't care about the detail of how many people were in Ashab al-Kahf as it relates to you guys and as it relates to the moral of the story. Because in that story, it goes through the whole story, and then it says, some have said these guys were 5, some have said they're 6, some have said they're 8, if I got the numbers right. But it never tells you which one is correct. And we know for God, it would have been so easy for him to just say, hey, by the way, there was 8 of them, right? And with the dog, they would have been 9, for example. Or there was 5 of them, and with the dog, there would have been like 6, for example, right? But because it says, سَيَقُولُونَ ثَلَاثَةٌ رَابِعُهُمْ كَلْبُهُمْ وَيَقُولُونَ خَمْسَةٌ سَادِسُهُمْ كَلْبُهُمْ. Some say there were 3 and then the dog was the 4th, right? Some say no, there were 5 and then the dog made him 6, right? وَيَقُولُونَ سَبْعَةٌ وَثَامِنُهُمْ كَلْبُهُمْ قُلْ رَبِّي أَعْلَمُ بِعِدَّتِهِمْ مَا يَعْلَمُهُمْ إِلَّا قَلِيلٌ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what their number is. Couldn't he just have told us how many there were? He could have, but he is not doing that on purpose to show us that the details of these stories are not details that matter necessarily in the grand scheme of what the moral of this story is going to be. So we don't know where this garden is. We just know that this is a story that the Quran is essentially narrating for us. Before I go into the story, I'm just going to check to see if we have any answers. All right. Nose is a sign of pride. That's one answer that we got. The mark on the nose acts as a label, meaning that their true self will be brought to the surface. Okay. On Instagram, The sister is saying the mark on their nose will expose and humiliate them. Very close. Brother Amir on Facebook is saying maybe it is a sign of humiliation and defeat. Reference mark on their nose. Okay, yes, the answer is, I think 2 or 3 of you guys got it correct. When the Quran says سَنَسِمُهُ عَلَى الْخُرْطُومِ, we will mark their nose, essentially the Quran is saying that this is our way of, first of all, targeting this individual, and second of all, humiliating him. When does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala humiliate someone? You see, there's different types of punishments on the Day of Judgment, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala humiliates someone. He puts him down when this person was trying to stand out. This person was trying to stand out by openly rejecting the message of the Prophet. The Quran says your punishment is humiliation. It's going to be the exact opposite of what you did, right? So the same way you tried to stand out and humiliate the Prophet, we will do the same to you and we will try to humiliate you. That's why the Quran says سَنَسِمُهُ عَلَى الْخُرْطُومِ. The nose, as the brother mentioned in one of the comments, the nose is seen as a symbol, essentially, of the pride of an individual. That's why in the ahadith we read that if you do this act of worship, for example, then you have taken the nose of shaitan, right? And you have placed dirt on his nose. This was a saying in Arabic, and you have it in Farsi as well, where essentially if you put dirt on the nose of someone, that means you humiliated them, right? It's a saying that they have. So, and that act of worship in particular is salat, right? The hadith says that there is nothing that puts dirt on the nose of shaitan, which again is a literal way of translating the hadith. The proper way would be, there is nothing that will humiliate shaitan like salat. When someone is praying, this is the greatest form of humiliating shaitan. The reason why they have that saying is because obviously the nose is the first thing that appears in the presence of somebody, and therefore it's kind of seen as like your appearance, right? And so if it's dirty or if it's marked, essentially you're going to stand out and you will be humiliated and embarrassed. So that's why the Quran says سَنَسِمُهُ عَلَى الْخُرْطُومِ. So great. I think 2 or 3 of you guys got that correct. Okay, moving on with the story, and I'll be wrapping up soon, inshallah. The story then says this, that these guys had this garden. And in history we read, we don't know this for sure necessarily, but in history we read that this garden had been given to them by a father that they had. And that this father of theirs was essentially a type of person who was kind. He was the type of person who would give fruits from his garden to those who were poor, to those who were needy and would come to take from the fruits of this garden. Or what we also read is that when they used to come and pick the fruits while the father was in charge of this garden, that they wouldn't pick all the fruits. They would leave some of the fruits, right? And when they would leave some of the fruits, essentially the people who were poor, they would come afterwards, they would grab some of the fruits, and this was what they would take away from that garden. So this was his form of giving in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what we read in the story is that now the father has passed away and that this garden has now been passed down to his children. And there's multiple of them because the Quran keeps using plural pronouns for them. And these children, of course, they're not as generous. But it's interesting, we have this in hadith, that when someone is generous, they will never take everything that you offer to them. They will never take everything. They'll usually leave a little bit aside, right? So for example, the hadith says essentially that an honorable person, a generous person, I should say, this person, ma istaqsa qattu, he will never essentially take something fully because he's generous. He'll leave a little bit on the side, right? If he wants to, essentially you did something wrong against him and now it's time for him to do something, he won't do it in the same manner, right? He won't say the same thing that you said about him, for example. He'll hold back a little bit. If you want to give him some money, he may not take all of it, for example. Just a character and a conduct of a generous individual. These guys got together. They said, enough with this, giving away our fruits to those who are poor. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the garden and we are going to make sure that we don't leave behind any of the fruits. Okay, so the Quran says, إِذْ أَقْسَمُوا لَيَصْرِمُنَّهَا مُصْبِحِينَ. When they got together and they swore, right, they made this pact that as a group, we're going to go towards our garden And what we're going to do early in the morning, musbihin, we will make sure وَلَا يَسْتَثْنُونَ, that we will not leave behind anything. يَسْتَثْنُون comes from istithna, meaning that you will not leave an exception for any of these fruits. You're going to take every single fruit that you will find out there. So what happens, these guys of course make this decision that the next morning they're going to do this. And of course that night they're going to go to sleep. When they do go to sleep, the Quran tells us that while these guys are asleep, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came and essentially ruined their whole garden. Now, I want you to pause for a second, and this will be the last point I'm making, inshallah. Pause for a second and think how much of a time, how much of a period of time or a gap there was between them actually making the decision to go and stop giving fruit to those who are poor, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sending His punishment and ruining their garden. How much of a gap in terms of the time was there between these two? If the Quran tells us فَطَافَ عَلَيْهَا طَاعِفٌ مِّن رَبِّكَ وَهُمْ نَائِمُونَ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent some sort of a punishment. It might have been like a storm, might have been thunder. We don't know exactly what it was. And it seems as though it was thunder. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent this thunder, وَهُمْ نَائِمُونَ, while they're still asleep. So that means when they decided to do this wrong deed, and from that time until when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent this thunder, there might have been a gap of 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. Let's just say 8 hours max, right? Let's say you slept for 8 hours, right? So the Quran says while they're still asleep. And that means, 8, 10 hours. So essentially less than 1 day. To wrap it up, right? To summarize, less than 1 day. Before these guys could even move and get to the garden is already ruined. What does that teach us, brothers and sisters? That teaches us that when we decide to do haram, right, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment might be right around the corner. We are used to this idea, and I say this and I speak of myself first and foremost, we are used to this idea that, we'll do haram, and then life will just go on. No, life may not necessarily always go on. Sometimes it goes on because He's trying to give you an opportunity. But sometimes it might not go on. Sometimes this time, where you break the heart of that brother or sister, when you backbite about that brother or sister, sometimes the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might come the next morning. And therefore, it always, baffles me, and the verses of the Quran say that it is surprising to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well, of people who will wrong Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of people who will sin, and then they won't do tawbah immediately. It's like as if they're not afraid. They feel so immune to it. And that's a dangerous thing. For you to commit the sin is one thing, but then that when you do commit the sin, you feel this fake immunity. Like nothing is going to happen to me. Who told you that? Because the verses of the Quran tell us that when someone sins, they now walk into the lines of the enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are functioning as an enemy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They may not be an enemy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You might be an overall good person. But this deed that you did puts you amongst those who function as an enemy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? And when you function in that manner, the functioning of the world starts to deal with you and function with you as if you are an enemy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. And therefore, the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might come at any given moment. For those who were with us when we were doing tafsir of Surah Al-Mulk, we discussed this. The Quran says, how are these guys feeling so safe that when they sin and they disobey us, and then they walk around as if our punishment may not come at any given moment? And in Surah Al-A'raf we read that these guys, أَفَأَمِنُوا مَكْرَ اللَّهِ, do they just feel safe that we're not going to start plotting against them? Do they feel safe that they'll go and commit the sin, then they'll come home and sleep, and that we won't, for example, send a punishment on them while they're asleep? Or they'll commit a sin and they'll go about their day-to-day activities, and that we won't send a punishment on them during the day, for example. How are these guys feeling so safe? The Quran is saying when you commit a sin, at the very least, you are supposed to have alarms going off in your mind, right? You're supposed to have a bunch of sirens going off. Like right now, I am not safe when it comes to anything because this air that I breathe might get the best of me. The earth that I'm walking on hates me right now because I committed the sin and I haven't repented yet, right? Not for someone who repents, for someone who hasn't repented yet. As long as this person has not reached the state of repentance, he is still in the state of sinning. As long as that is the case, everything in this world might turn into a punishment for him at any given moment. These guys, they essentially didn't even get the opportunity to go to the garden and pick all the fruits, and then the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would come. That's what you would assume what would happen, right? That's not what happened. These guys just made a decision, right? They made a pact that, you know what, this is what we're going to do tomorrow. And before they could make it to the garden, essentially the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had come for them. So this is a lesson for us that when we do something wrong, of course we're not perfect. We might end up doing something wrong. But the key is that when I do end up doing something wrong, that I repent immediately, that I don't walk around feeling safe, that I don't walk around feeling like, yeah, God didn't see it, or God saw it, but He doesn't really care about it. No, the Quran says you might just be walking around, the punishment might come at any given moment. If I committed a sin, and I'm sitting here, then that means this roof might fall on me at any given moment as a punishment. That means, someone might approach me and hit me as a punishment. It can come from any, direction. And God forbid, sometimes it comes from a direction that you don't even realize that you're being punished. And of course, that is the worst. Inshallah, tomorrow, what we will do is we will continue with the story that we reach this point where their garden is destroyed. What was their reaction? And how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala going to take this story and have it be related to what the people of Quraysh are coming and telling the Prophet? What is the moral for the Prophet? Because essentially, if you remember, the Quran was talking about these people who have money and authority, and then it brought up this story. So then this story is going to relate again to what the people of Quraysh are doing, essentially. Then afterwards, inshallah, we'll move on to a very, very important concept that Surah Al-Qalam will talk about, and that is how people speak on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That one I'm very passionate about, so I'll be talking about that and elaborating that on quite a bit, because that is something that you will see in today's world where everybody will speak on behalf of God as if God can't speak on His own behalf. And the Quran challenges this perspective, and it's a very scary perspective. So that, inshallah, we will be discussing tomorrow, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Do we have, this from Sister Ifrah, don't we have more details in Torah and Injil and Quran in just a summary? We might have more details in Injil and the Torah. The problem is that the details that we have in the Torah and the Injil, because the Torah and the Injil is essentially lost in history, we don't have access to the real Torah and Injil. What we do have in the Old Testament and the New Testament is details that have been passed along by people. And when anything is passed along by people, it's essentially vulnerable to mistake. So that's the problem with the details that you have in there. Otherwise, yes, that is a fact that our scholars, sometimes when they're stuck between two different opinions about the story of a certain prophet, for example, sometimes they will look at how the story is mentioned in terms of that particular detail in the New Testament or the Old Testament, for example. And then based on that, sometimes they might prefer that, yeah, this is how this part of the story actually happen as it relates to those parts of the Quran that are not 100% clear when it comes to the details. So they do have more details. It's just that, of course, those books are not reliable where you can't swear on them. In the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, there are different details that we're not sure about. Sometimes you will find mufassirin, they say, you know what, this is the way it probably happened, because this is the way the New Testament, for example, or I should say the Old Testament, has narrated the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. So that does happen. You do have more details, but the details, unfortunately, are not very reliable. Okay, thank you very much for being with us. I don't see any more questions, so inshallah we'll wrap up today's session. And like I said, tomorrow, inshallah, we'll finish Surah Al-Qalam all the way until the last verse. And Thursday, inshallah, I think we'll just have a full session on the idea of the evil eye and how that verse of the Quran speaks of the evil eye, or does it not, or does it prove that we believe in such a thing as the evil eye, and what is essentially the context of that verse. Inshallah, that will be our last session. So we won't be able to get to discuss the last surah on the flyer, which is Surah Al-Tahrim, but hopefully we'll get another chance some other time to discuss that. Thank you very much for being with us, and keep us in your du'as, and we will see you tomorrow, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.